the whole, or the effects of unrealized inadequacy on the human condition. It was with no small degree of reluctance that Mr. Archibald Featherstone rose from his bed one morning in early spring. The previous evening had been spent, as most of his evenings were, in resolute inactivity, a pursuit he excelled in to such a degree that he might have been considered a professional had the field ever been formalized. But spring mornings being what they are, cruel, Mr. Featherstone was compelled to face it, along with the indignities of breakfast toast that refused to brown evenly. His home, a modest brick affair with pretensions of grandeur, sat amidst a patch of garden so uninspired that even the weeds seemed bored of it. It was during his perfunctory glance out the kitchen window, as he waited for his second piece of toast to self-immolate, that he noticed something amiss. The lawn, which he preferred to ignore, had developed what one might generously describe as a personality. A small dark hole marred its otherwise unremarkable surface. He muttered, squinting at the offending blemish. A lesser man might have felt an ominous chill or indulged in fanciful thoughts of buried treasure. Mr. Featherstone, however, was not inclined toward fancy before his morning tea. He scratched his chin and dismissed the hole with a philosopher's detachment. Holes, after all, were nature's business, not his. By the time his toast had cooled to the temperature of disappointment, the hole had crept back into his mind, or rather, his ambitions. A splendid opportunity, he mused aloud, though no one was present to hear him. Practice makes perfect, and what better use for a hole than golf? He rummaged through the hall closet, extracting a battered 9-iron and a collection of golf balls, which had previously been consigned to gathering dust after an ill-advised flirtation with athleticism. Armed with his equipment, Mr. Featherstone ventured into the garden. Mr. Featherstone had at one time entertained the fanciful notion of becoming a golf professional, a figure of enviable leisure and understated glory, strolling across manicured greens while adoring crowds whispered reverently about his impeccable swing. The only thing that had stood in his way, as he saw it, was a trifling lack of practice, exacerbated by the extortionate fees demanded by even the most mediocre courses. The finer establishments, of course, were entirely out of reach unless one possessed the sort of connections that came from knowing someone who knew someone, which Mr. Featherstone unfortunately did not. But now, here was fortune smiling upon him at last, a course of his very own, conveniently located in the backyard and available at all hours, free of charge and the meddling interference of club secretaries. With this unparalleled advantage, he had no doubt that his latent talent, untried but unquestionably vast, would soon catapult him to the pinnacle of the golfing world. It was, he thought, the sort of opportunity that came along only once in a lifetime. The first swing was a masterpiece of incompetence. The ball, rather than flying gracefully toward its target, described a brief and chaotic arc before landing squarely in the rosebush. The bush, affronted, responded with a vengeful thorn to Mr. Featherstone's hand. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed, inspecting the damage. "This is precisely why professional golfers don't garden." Undeterred, he retrieved the ball and positioned himself for another attempt. By the sixth swing, he had managed to land a ball squarely in the vicinity of the hole. With a satisfying plop, it disappeared into the dark abyss. "Excellent," he declared, ignoring the fact that his stroke count would have disqualified him from any respectable game. His enthusiasm was short-lived. No sooner had he begun to appreciate his ingenuity than the true cost of his endeavour became apparent. One after another, his golf balls vanished into the hole, with no sign of retrieval. At 5 shillings a ball, Mr. Featherstone began to calculate the expenses with growing unease. As he lined up for yet another swing, a sharp bark interrupted him. Muffin, the neighbour's dog, had arrived to oversee the proceedings. Muffin was a creature of limited charm and limitless opinions, which he expressed freely. Today his opinion seemed to be that golf was a ridiculous pursuit, best abandoned in favour of something more dignified, such as ball-chasing. "Quiet, Muffin," Mr. Featherstone scolded. Muffin responded by sitting, tail wagging, and fixing him with a stare so judgmental it might have been mistaken for sentience. When a particularly wild shot sent the ball skittering toward the neighbour's fence, Muffin sprang into action, barking furiously and lunging after it. Mr. Featherstone, alarmed, chased after him, his 9-iron flailing like an over-enthusiastic semaphore. The chase ended when Muffin, having retrieved the ball, spat it out disdainfully at Mr. Featherstone's feet and resumed his post of silent disapproval. "Thank you, Muffin," Mr. Featherstone said, though the words carried no sincerity. He glanced at the hole, now filled with the echoes of his missing golf balls, and sighed. It was going to be a long day. By the end of his first day as a self-proclaimed golfer, Mr. Featherstone had run out of golf balls, an oversight he attributed not to his enthusiastic swings, but to a conspiracy of bad luck, poor ball design, and the bottomless cup, which swallowed at least one ball. Unwilling to abandon his nascent career, he resolved to improvise. The garden was promptly raided for potential substitutes. Cotton balls were the first candidate, but they proved embarrassingly susceptible to the faintest breeze, veering off course in a manner that Mr. Featherstone felt was deeply unprofessional. Ice cubes were tried next, but their unfortunate tendency to melt before he could complete his elaborate pre-shot ritual rendered them wholly impractical. A brief flirtation with tennis balls followed, but it seemed unsporting, offending his sense of purity. "This isn't golf," he declared aloud. "It's some bastardized amalgamation of sports, a Frankensteinian mockery." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Mr. Featherstone sat on his garden bench, gazing at the hole with a mixture of exhaustion and disdain. The day had revealed truths he had not wished to confront. Golf, he concluded, was a ridiculous enterprise, fit only for the idle rich whose peculiar temperaments required constant distraction, lest they revert to smashing vases or taking ill-advised swings at the family butler. What better guise for their peculiarities than a so-called sport that demanded incessant whacking of little white balls across expanses of unnecessarily pristine grass? To the casual observer, they might appear as ordinary men of leisure, engaged in a noble pursuit. But Mr. Featherstone now saw the truth. Golf was a thin veneer of respectability pasted over the mad antics of otherwise unsupervised lunatics armed with long-shafted clubs. As he prodded at his overcooked stew, a meal that seemed more of a personal rebuke than nourishment, Mr. Featherstone tried valiantly to think of something, anything, besides the hole. Yet his thoughts orbited it like moths around a flickering lamp. He rose periodically to peer out the window, half expecting to see it yawning wider with every glance. The moonlight played tricks on his eyes, casting shifting shadows that seemed to stretch its edges, and while he told himself this was surely an illusion, a small, persistent voice in his head whispered otherwise. It was just as well, he reflected, that he had abandoned his golfing ambitions. He had no desire to become the talk of the neighbourhood, a man driven mad by an unhealthy obsession with sinking balls into the ever-hungry maw of his garden. Besides, with the hole growing to such an absurd size, the challenge had evaporated. A hole-in-one achieved under these circumstances would hardly merit applause. Indeed, it would be more difficult to miss than to succeed. No, golf was behind him now, and it was for the best. He resolved firmly to forget the hole entirely, but even as he said it, his gaze drifted once more to the window, where the dark expanse seemed to wink at him, as if sharing a private joke. Mr. Archibald Featherstone, though not a man given to sudden bursts of inspiration, occasionally stumbled upon what he considered brilliance. After a fitful night's sleep, filled with vague nightmares of golfing purgatory and accusatory dogs, he awoke with a plan as clear as his morning tea was not. The hole in the garden, he decided, was an opportunity in disguise. Why limit himself to golf when he could have a swimming pool? Pools, after all, were the height of sophistication. Never mind that his garden was roughly the size of a dining table. Practicality had never been one of his constraints. By mid-afternoon, the idea had taken firm root, and Mr. Featherstone made his way to the local shop. He returned triumphantly with a pair of ill-fitting swim trunks, the cheapest goggles available, and a quiet confidence that this would be his legacy. Mr. Featherstone, in the grip of his aquatic ambitions, could already see the headlines. Featherstone, a name synonymous with swimming excellence. His exploits would inspire generations. Statues would be erected of him in heroic poses, goggles perched nobly on his brow, his swim trunks billowing modestly in bronze. The English Channel? a mere puddle to be crossed with an effortless backstroke. The Olympics? His playground. He envisioned himself atop the podium so frequently, the national anthem perpetually ringing in his ears, that he began humming it absent-mindedly over breakfast. Freestyle, backstroke, butterfly, breaststroke, the medley. He would claim them all, his victories so frequent and predictable that spectators would arrive solely to admire the novelty of his modest, celebratory wave. But even Mr. Featherstone, visionary that he was, recognized the precariousness of greatness. It was only a matter of time before the Olympic Committee, in their relentless pursuit of novelty, introduced events so absurd that his legacy might be overshadowed. Crab walking, backwards running, speed crawling and skipping would become the new frontiers of human endurance, and Featherstone, confined to the water, would watch from the sidelines as lesser athletes sidestepped their way into history. With events at every conceivable distance, from the 10-metre dash to the 47.5-mile endurance crawl, it was inevitable that his records, no matter how Herculean, would one day fall to an overzealous newcomer with a peculiar knack for sideways ambulation. He sighed at the thought, not with envy, but with pity, for how tragic it would be to rise to fame only to have it tethered to a discipline as undignified as competitive skipping. It was, after all, a legacy he would leave, not merely for his own glory, but for the integrity of sport itself. The challenge of filling the pool, however, proved trickier. It would not do to incur the wrath of the water company, nor could he tolerate the expense. So, with the stealth of a cat burglar and the grace of a particularly clumsy ox, he devised a solution: the neighbour's garden hose. Late that night, under the cover of darkness, Mr. Featherstone donned an inconspicuous ensemble of mismatched pyjamas and an old scarf. Armed with a watering can, a decoy in case he needed an alibi, he crept into his neighbour's garden. The hose was coiled neatly by the side of the house. He was mid-unspooling when a low growl made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Muffin. The dog materialized from the shadows like a vengeful spirit, his small frame trembling with indignation. "Now, Muffin, let's be reasonable," Mr. Featherstone whispered, his voice trembling. Muffin, unimpressed by reason, barked with the fury of a beast 10 times his size. The chase that followed was a spectacle of chaos. Mr. Featherstone darted through flower beds, leapt over a wheelbarrow, and at one point became briefly entangled in the garden gnome display. Muffin pursued with unrelenting zeal, his barks ringing out like an alarm bell. In a desperate bid for freedom, Mr. Featherstone veered toward the hole in his garden, only to realize too late that the trajectory was all wrong. Muffin, equally oblivious, hurtled after him. The dog's bark cut off abruptly with a yelp as he disappeared into the abyss. Mr. Featherstone skidded to a halt at the edge, peering down into the darkness. "Oh dear," he murmured, torn between guilt and an undeniable sense of relief. Muffin was no longer a problem, at least for now. He replaced the hose with an air of exaggerated nonchalance and retreated to his house, muttering something about the survival instincts of small dogs. At first light, Mr. Featherstone ventured out to inspect his handiwork. The night's efforts had, in his estimation, gone swimmingly. The hole should now be brimming with water, awaiting its debut as the premier luxury feature of his modest home. What greeted him instead was a cruel betrayal. The water, which he had so laboriously stolen, had vanished entirely, leaving behind a smaller hole at the bottom of the first. "Well, that's just rude," he muttered, glaring at the ungrateful hole. Before he could contemplate his next move, his neighbour appeared, her expression a curious mixture of concern and suspicion. "Morning, Archibald. You haven't seen Muffin, have you?" she asked. "He's missing, and he never leaves the yard." Mr. Featherstone cleared his throat. "Ah, Muffin. Fine dog, yes. Always had a wandering spirit, I thought. Being a creature of such evident spirit and ambition, perhaps he's taken up a higher calling?" The neighbour blinked. "A higher calling?" "Yes. Well, you know how dogs can be. Freedom-loving creatures, the lot of them. Probably joined a circus or started a revolution. Hard to say exactly." The neighbour stared at him, mouth slightly open. He seized the opportunity to excuse himself, citing the need to consult with a professional about some unusual geological phenomena. As he returned to the house, he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt, but he consoled himself with the thought that Muffin, wherever he was, had likely found peace, or, at the very least, silence. By the third week, the hole in Mr. Featherstone's garden had grown to such alarming proportions that even he, a man of unparalleled procrastination, was forced to admit that action was required. Having exhausted all personal attempts to tame the abyss, including golf, swimming, and muttered curses, he reluctantly turned to the city authorities for assistance. The process of filing a complaint was predictably labyrinthine. After an hour of navigating an automated phone system, punctuated by the occasional threat to hang up, he finally reached a human operator. "A growing hole, you say?" the operator repeated, her tone sceptical. "Yes, quite," said Mr. Featherstone. "It started small, but has, well, developed ambitions. If this goes unchecked, I fear it might apply for its own postal code." A week later, the promised city inspector arrived, equipped with a clipboard, a measuring tape, and the air of a man who had long since stopped asking questions. The inspector surveyed the hole with an expression that suggested he had seen far worse in his career. He murmured, kneeling by the edge and extending the tape measure into the void. "Depth, incalculable. Diameter, variable, depending on where you stand. Composition, profoundly inconvenient." He scribbled furiously on his clipboard, nodding to himself. "And," Mr. Featherstone prompted, hopeful for some kind of solution. "And what?" the inspector replied, looking genuinely puzzled. "What do we do about it?" Well, I'll have to escalate this to the higher-ups," the inspector said gravely, tapping his pen against the clipboard. "But I can't make any promises. Holes are tricky." With that, he departed, leaving Mr. Featherstone standing by the hole more frustrated than ever. A fortnight later, a fleet of garbage trucks descended upon the neighbourhood like a noisy, malodorous invasion. It seemed the city's grand solution was not to fill the hole with something sensible, like dirt, but rather with rubbish. "This," said Mr. Featherstone to a passing worker, "is your idea of remediation." "Reckon so," the man replied, shrugging as he heaved a bag of something distinctly odorous into the abyss. "Cheap, effective, and no one'll miss it." The trucks came day and night, their cacophony echoing through the previously peaceful neighbourhood. With them came smells so diverse and offensive that Mr. Featherstone began cataloguing them for lack of better distraction. There was the sharp tang of rotting fish, the sour stench of curdled milk, and a mysterious, almost philosophical odour he could only describe as existential despair. Complaints to the city were met with polite indifference. "Your grievance has been noted and escalated," said the latest bureaucrat, a phrase so empty it might as well have been tossed into the hole itself. As the garbage trucks became a fixture of his days, Mr. Featherstone discovered that his nights were to be no less disturbed. It began with furtive shadows slipping through the garden, carrying bundles of dubious origin. At first, he assumed it was an isolated incident, until he looked out one evening and saw a queue of figures stretching down the lane, all waiting patiently to dump their cargo into the hole. Curiously, the criminals were remarkably well behaved. They formed an orderly line, chatting amicably as they waited their turn. A burly man with a crowbar even paused to hold the line for an elderly woman carrying a suspiciously lumpy carpet. "Well, I'll say this for them," Mr. Featherstone muttered to himself. "They have better manners than most." The objects they disposed of varied wildly. There were the usual suspects: black bags, mysterious crates, and the occasional barrel oozing something ominous. But there were also items that raised troubling questions: a cello, a set of medieval armour, and what Mr. Featherstone could have sworn was a fiberglass dolphin. As if the nightly influx of criminals wasn't enough, the hole began attracting an entirely different crowd during the day. Religious zealots, convinced of the hole's divine significance, appeared in droves. They littered his garden with candles, arranged in haphazard shapes that they claimed were holy symbols, but which Mr. Featherstone suspected were the result of poor spatial reasoning. They sang hymns of dubious melody, chanted in languages he was certain they had made up, and loitered with an air of self-righteousness that made his teeth itch. By comparison, the criminals were a model of decorum. They arrived quietly, respected his property, and left no trace of their activities beyond the occasional faint odour of industrial solvent. The worshippers, however, treated his garden as their personal sanctuary, leaving behind wax drippings, litter, and an overwhelming sense of moral superiority. "If I had to choose," Mr. Featherstone mused one morning, stepping over a discarded tambourine, "I'd take the criminals. At least they clean up after themselves." The hole, meanwhile, continued to grow, indifferent to its newfound fame and the chaos it inspired. Mr. Featherstone could only shake his head and wonder what fresh absurdities it might summon next. Mr. Featherstone had long suspected that his relationship with the hole in his garden was not merely antagonistic, but actively spiteful. Every attempt to ignore it, contain it, or reason with it had been met with defiance. Yet nothing prepared him for the morning he looked out of his bedroom window and realized the hole had moved. There it was, bold as brass, yawning dangerously close to his back doorstep. The once modest gap had swelled into a cavernous abyss, its edge now grazing the flower pots that lined his patio. Mr. Featherstone stared at it for a long moment, teacup suspended halfway to his lips. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose that settles it. The thing wants the house, always did have a certain air of entitlement." He considered his options, which were few and uniformly unappealing. He could call the city again, but past experience had taught him that their response would likely involve more garbage trucks or, worse, additional paperwork. He could pack up and leave, but the thought of moving his belongings, especially the set of encyclopedias he hadn't opened since he bought them, filled him with dread. In the end, he chose the path of least resistance. With a resigned shrug, he drained his tea, shuffled back to bed, and pulled the covers over his head. "It's my day off," he muttered. "If the hole swallows me, it can wait until tomorrow." When Mr. Featherstone awoke, it was to an unsettling stillness. The usual cacophony of garbage trucks, chanting zealots, and muffled midnight activity was conspicuously absent. Even the birds, which he had come to think of as irrepressibly optimistic, because upon reaching their threshold of inconvenience, they could simply fly away, leaving the rest of the world to wrestle with its troubles while they flitted off to greener trees and less distressing circumstances, were silent. Frowning, he rose and padded to the front door, still clad in his rumpled sleeping pyjamas and a pair of mismatched slippers. He opened it to a sight that was at once surreal and oddly inevitable. His house, pristine and intact, sat perched at the edge of an unfathomable void. The ground had vanished entirely. Below him stretched a sprawling sea of garbage, piles of refuse, broken furniture, and objects he could not and did not wish to identify. Above, far in the distance, he thought he could see a faint pinprick of light, like a star winking at him from an unreachable sky. "Well, this is inconvenient," he said, stepping onto his porch. A soggy newspaper drifted down from above, landing on his front step with a damp splat. He sighed and retrieved it, shaking off the worst of the moisture. The headline read, "Local man complained about hole now gone." "Unbelievable," he muttered, as the dampness of the paper seemed to seep into his mood, as though the weather had conspired with the editorial staff to leave him both soggy and indignant. He folded the offending article with exaggerated precision, a futile attempt to restore dignity to a publication so clearly devoid of it. "Gone," he repeated aloud, as though testing the word might reveal some hidden nuance. "They say it as if holes simply evaporate when scolded, like a naughty spaniel slinking off to its basket." He glanced down the abyss where the so-called gone hole sat in blatant defiance of its obituary, a dark and persistent gap that had clearly not been informed of its non-existence. "I suppose I should be grateful," he mused, tapping the paper thoughtfully against his palm. "In another week they'll have me declaring war on sinkholes, or proposing a treaty with potholes, all to liven up the front page." The thought amused him, briefly, before the familiar weight of irritation settled in again. There was nothing for it. He'd have to pay a visit to the editor. Not for justice, of course, that was far too optimistic, but simply to observe firsthand how one managed to operate a printing press without a conscience. As he surveyed the landscape, he noticed something odd, a narrow path winding through the heaps of trash, as though someone, or something, had carved out a route for him. It was hardly inviting, flanked as it was by precarious towers of discarded appliances and the occasional unsettling glint of something metallic. But it was the only discernible option. Mr. Featherstone adjusted the waistband of his rumpled pyjamas, shuffled his mismatched slippers into place, and set off with the weary determination of a man who had long since stopped expecting good things from life. "Right then," he muttered as he stepped onto the path. "Let's see where this ridiculous business leads." Behind him, another piece of trash, a battered teddy bear missing an eye, fell from the pinprick of light above and landed with a soft plop. It seemed to watch him as he disappeared into the labyrinth. As Mr. Featherstone followed the winding path, he found himself descending deeper into the earth. The air grew cooler, tinged with a metallic tang, and the garbage heaps began to thin out, replaced by smooth, gleaming walls that pulsed faintly with an otherworldly light. He rounded a final corner and stopped short, his jaw dropping. Before him sprawled a vast, futuristic city, its silhouette a blend of angular spires and peculiar domes that looked suspiciously like oversized golf balls. The streets buzzed with activity, populated by small, pale humanoids with large eyes and an air of frenetic purpose. "Ah!" cried one of the creatures, spotting him. "The surface dweller. He has arrived." A crowd gathered almost instantly, their faces alight with something that might have been reverence or mild delirium. It was hard to tell. Before he could protest, Mr. Featherstone was hoisted onto a platform that whisked him toward a central plaza. "You must forgive our excitement," said a troglodyte, who introduced himself as Zilpo, the Minister of Gratitude. "We have long awaited the arrival of the one who transformed our civilization." "I think you might have the wrong man," Mr. Featherstone stammered, though he didn't entirely mind the attention. "Nonsense!" Zilpo exclaimed. "Your contributions have been invaluable. Allow us to explain." The crowd erupted into applause as Zilpo led Mr. Featherstone through the city, pointing out various marvels. "See our domed structures, inspired by the spherical objects you so generously provided, your golf balls, as you call them." Mr. Featherstone squinted at one of the buildings. It did bear a striking resemblance to his wayward 9-iron projectiles, right down to the dimples. "And the water you funneled into the hole," Zilpo continued, "allowed us to irrigate our subterranean crops. We now grow a wide variety of fungi, algae, and, well, mostly fungi." "Yes, well," Mr. Featherstone mumbled, "I was trying to make a pool, actually." Zilpo waved this off as an amusing anecdote. "And of course, the trash. Thanks to your surface civilization's endless waste, we've developed an advanced energy grid. Garbage powers everything down here." "Everything?" Mr. Featherstone asked, genuinely impressed. "Well, almost," Zilpo admitted. "The universal translator is still on batteries, but we're working on it." The crowd cheered again, and Mr. Featherstone couldn't help but puff out his chest. For the first time in his life, his efforts, or lack thereof, were being celebrated, and it filled him with a profound sense of satisfaction. This, he thought, was all he had ever wanted: recognition, admiration, and the warm glow of being undeniably important, even if it had all come about without merit. That evening, a grand feast was held in Mr. Featherstone's honour. The troglodytes served him a banquet of their finest fungi-based delicacies, and Zilpo delivered a speech extolling his virtues. "To the surface dweller who has given us so much, we say, thank you. Without your... what is the word? Carelessness. Without your carelessness, none of this would have been possible." Mr. Featherstone, though slightly irked by the phrasing, beamed with pride. He had never been called a hero before, and he found that he rather liked it. Perhaps, he thought, his life had turned out well, after all. As the feast reached its crescendo, a familiar sound cut through the revelry. A bark. Mr. Featherstone froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Is that—" The crowd parted to reveal Muffin, trotting toward the stage with an air of smug satisfaction. Around his neck was a sleek metal collar with blinking lights. "We found this creature not long ago," Zilpo explained. "He has been most helpful in providing insight into your surface world. With a universal translator, of course." "Universal translator?" Mr. Featherstone echoed weakly. The collar emitted a soft hum, and Muffin's bark transformed into an unmistakable voice, one dripping with righteous indignation. "Well, well, if it isn't him," Muffin glared at Mr. Featherstone with all the fury his small frame could muster. "The one who tossed me into a hole and abandoned me to my fate. Villain! Scoundrel! Unrepentant brute! That's hardly fair, Mr. Featherstone protested, though his words were drowned out by the gasps of the troglodytes. He let me fall into darkness, Muffin continued, his voice rising. And for what? A garden hose. This man is no hero. He is a menace. The troglodytes turned on Mr. Featherstone, their expressions shifting from adoration to outrage. Surface dweller, Zilpo declared, his voice heavy with disappointment. Your actions have betrayed our trust. We cannot allow such a creature to remain among us. But I didn't do anything, Mr. Featherstone began, only to be cut off. Guards, escort him to the surface. The guards led him to a sleek, shining lift, and for a brief, hopeful moment he thought they were being merciful. Then Zilpo shook his head. No, not the lift. He must take the stairs. The stairs? Mr. Featherstone repeated, horrified. The guards pointed to a winding, seemingly endless staircase that spiraled upward into the gloom. As he began his grueling ascent, the troglodytes returned to their feast, and Muffin's smug voice echoed after him. Serves you right. With each step, Mr. Featherstone muttered under his breath, vowing to never again underestimate the vindictiveness of small dogs or the consequences of his own carelessness. After what felt like hours of trudging up the spiralling staircase, Mr. Featherstone emerged, gasping for air and drenched in sweat, into the blinding light of the surface world. He blinked a few times, expecting to see his familiar neighborhood, the houses, the trees, the ordinary sights that had always surrounded him. But instead he was greeted by the stark expanse of a vast parking lot, its gleaming asphalt stretching endlessly, punctuated only by neat rows of cars and a sign, bold, garish, and utterly appalling. The great subterranean wonder. Adults, 5 shillings, children, half price. His house and yard were gone, replaced by a bustling attraction. Lines of tourists snaked around a hastily constructed wooden booth, where a bored-looking attendant handed out tickets and small pamphlets detailing the history of the marvellous Mystery Hole. Mr. Featherstone's jaw dropped. He wandered closer, scarcely able to believe his eyes. There were souvenir stands selling miniature replicas of the hole, complete with tiny figures of troglodytes, and children clamouring for overpriced snacks shaped like golf balls. Typical, he muttered. The whole thing's gone commercial. He spotted a plaque mounted near the entrance. It read, Discovered by anonymous resident. Anonymous, he sputtered. This was my hole. I contributed golf balls, water, and, well, trash. Do I see a penny from this? No, but I shall. Oh, I most certainly shall. The thought of future correspondence with the city officials, this time demanding his share of the profits, gave him some comfort. He shook his head and sighed. Still, I suppose it's better than the garbage trucks and chanting zealots. With no house to return to and no great desire to stand in line for his own attraction, Mr. Featherstone realized there was only one option left. Work. He trudged toward the main road, grumbling all the while. The whole thing was probably the neighbour's fault. Muffin certainly didn't help. And the city. Don't get me started on them. A man can't have a decent hole in his garden without someone ruining it. As he passed by the entrance gate, something caught his eye. A faint depression in the earth. He stopped, leaned closer, and saw it. A small, dark hole, barely the size of a dinner plate, but unmistakable. He straightened up, brushed off his hands, and continued walking. Not my problem, he muttered. Not this time. And so Mr. Featherstone set off for work, head held high, or at least as high as it could be, given his overwhelming exasperation, ready to resume his ordinary life, content to leave the mysteries of the universe to someone else.